we're going to be referring to a book. We don't want to make this a promotion of the book. We'll tell you a little bit more about it. It's a book that 6 of us worked on. Actually, 6 of us primarily, and then 168 people around the world worked on. This is not a book promotion. It's sharing with you about it. We'll tell you later we can get it. It's through the ABC, and it's a Pacific Press book, but that's not the purpose. It's the topic that we want to share with you. Now I'm going to say something that I tell my preaching students don't say. I've had the occasion to teach preaching in, I don't know, from the United States to Russia, Africa, and Europe, different countries, to students. And I tell them, never get up and give an excuse and say, I'm just a young preacher, I'm not very good at it, and never do that. Just get up and talk. Okay? Well, I'm going to violate that rule.
He's not a young preacher.
I'm not a young preacher. And my colleague's not a young preacher either. But what I will tell you, this is the first time that Ruth and I are doing something like this together.
Is it?
Okay, very first time. Now, she has spoken publicly. She was an educator for quite a few years in her life and a school principal and had to address groups and so on. And I have preached, but we've never done it together. So if we kind of stumble here and that, be kind to us. You know, we're old people, and you don't want to abuse senior citizens. You know.
Well, this is my home church, so.
Yeah. But you see, so she may not feel nervous, but you know, this is not my home church. You know, so anyway, okay. So we're going to share with you, the two of us, about the Sabbath and what we've experienced. The Sabbath is a gift from God. Early on in Genesis 2, it is introduced as God's gift. It is amazing that God considered it so important that he introduced it at very creation time.
And then, as we have recited twice already this morning, the commandment that talks about the Sabbath, that you know.
Years later, in Isaiah 56:2, God talks about the blessings that we receive when we keep the Sabbath.
And Christ also was a part of his life. In Luke 4:16, he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read.
Mark 2:27, a very familiar passage, kind of puts a new emphasis on the Sabbath. Too many people saw it as a burden in their life, as something that they had to do. But Jesus put a stop to that and said, hold it. The Sabbath is made for you. You were not made for the Sabbath. And so that's the blessing that he shared with us. Yet, that Sabbath, that gift, was ignored. Not too long, tragically, not too long after Christ's resurrection and after he went back to heaven, we find pockets of resistance to the Sabbath. Sometimes we imagine like there was a magic day when somebody proclaimed, no more Sabbath, it's Sunday now. It didn't happen that way. It didn't happen. That's a misnomer. What happened is that there are various ways Sabbath was ignored. One reason people ignored the Sabbath as early as 150, AD 150, is because Christians were being associated as being Jews. You see, to the Romans, Christians and Jews all look the same. Why? The Romans had different images, different monuments that they worshipped, their gods. The Jews did not. Neither did the Christians. So to the Romans, they considered the Christians and the Jews to be pagans. They called them pagans. But what was the one thing they had in common? The Sabbath. And so some Christians started saying, well, maybe, maybe we need to differentiate. And an attitude of anti-Semitism even developed. An attitude against the Jews, so we got to be different. There was another reason, and that is that Christians met on Sabbath, and they met on Sunday, and they met on Monday. We would have evidence that they met almost every day for worship. Early in the morning, many of the early Christians were actually house servants, not kings and queens, but house servants. And they would get up early in the morning before they did their chores and have worship together. Okay? And so they used to get together on Sunday and celebrate the resurrection. Is there anything wrong with that? No. Not really. Not really. Christ did come out of the grave on Sunday, didn't he? Okay? I remember in one place in upstate New York, some churches got together and asked me to participate in the service, the sunrise service. And some of the Adventists said, well, how can you do that? I said, because Christ arose on the first day of the week. That's why I'm doing it. Not because they asked me, but because they didn't create that. Christ arose. And so what happened, there was a slow change that was taking place. It was not monumental right away. Later on, some of it was that way. But slowly, the Sabbath took a second place. And then, yes, there were some laws that Constantine passed, and some of the bishops did. But those were all pretty much after Sunday already had come in, pretty much. And sometimes we need to remind ourselves of that. Some argued that actually there was no Sabbath. It didn't matter to them. And in a lot of denominations, that is true. The Lutherans, for example, even today, they do not see the importance of Sunday is not their Sabbath. We cannot call Sunday their Sabbath. They don't call it that. It's a day of worship. That's when they get together, but it's not the Sabbath. Other Christians group claim that Sunday is the Sabbath. In the Reformation period, there was a kind of rediscovery of the Sabbath. Certain groups throughout continental Europe started keeping the Sabbath. Even before that, but certain groups sprang up. Other groups in the Balkan areas, where Mike, you and I have some roots from there was a group called Bogomils, people who advocated the seventh-day Sabbath. They also were anti-Trinitarian. So they were not really full Christians. So when the Muslims came, the Ottomans came and invaded that part of the world, it was easy for them to take on Islam. And that's the background of many of the Muslims in the Balkan countries today. But they were Sabbath keepers at one time. In England, there were pockets of Sabbath keepers. I am immersed in a book project about a man who wrote 8 books about the Sabbath. An Anglican priest, an Anglican pastor from Norwich, England, wrote 8 books. One of them is 230 pages, the other one is about 630 pages, and then smaller books. It was interesting, he had no interest in starting a new denomination. Not at all. He was committed to the Church of England. The Puritans were advocating strict Sunday keeping as a Sabbath. He said, no, you guys are wrong. It's the seventh day. It's the seventh day. And he never left the Church of England. He wanted the Church of England to become a Sabbath-keeping church. And by the way, England now has, or United Kingdom now has, Charles III, right? That's the name of the new king. Charles I, who reigned from 1625 till about 1640, and he was beheaded in 1649. Charles I put this man, Theophilus Brayburn, into prison over the Sabbath issue. And that prison was located, the first prison he stayed in was right by Westminster Abbey. If you've ever been to London, you have to go to Westminster Abbey. There was a prison called the Westgate Prison. And so there was interest in the Sabbath. Now, in the 1800s...
You forgot to tell him how much he was fined.
Well, I found a cash record of Charles I. According to it, Theophilus Brayburn was fined 1,000 pounds, which the best we can calculate is about $2 million today. Okay. That's a little more than we get in our Social Security check, you know, for the lifetime. But that's what Charles I did, fine him 1,000 pounds. And Brayburn spent almost a year and a half in prison over the Sabbath issue. By the 1800s, there was a religious movement in the United States the westward movement, the burnt over district of New York, Adventism grew out of that to some extent, and a new emphasis on the Sabbath. You know, the beginning again. And that's interesting. Seventh-day Adventists, those days and for many years, put a lot of emphasis on which day is the Sabbath, Sunday is not the Sabbath, who changed it, and so on. We didn't spend that much time on what the Sabbath really means to me and to you day to day. Okay? We spend more time and energy defending it than rather defining it. And I'm not saying it was wrong what they did, but I'm just saying that was the emphasis that was taking place. That was in the 1800s up into our period.
Okay. And so, as COVID started, a group of 6 of us, decided we wanted to work on a book about what the Sabbath means to me. And one person I only met recently was in California. 2 were in New York, and 3 of us in Maryland, and we met every Tuesday at 1 o'clock by Zoom for 2 years. We wrote to many, many, many people and asked them to tell us, what does the Sabbath mean to you? And cross professions, and
Well, who participated? About 168 people. Now, if you should get the book, please don't count the number, because I probably am wrong. I tell you how I came up with that number. The publishing house, Pacific Press, called me one day and say, we're designing the cover and we need to know something right away. What do you need to know? How many writers and how many countries are represented? So I did a quick count. And so if you find it's 1 or 2 more or less, it's okay. It's okay. But I had to give them a number. And so we estimate about 168 writers from around the world and from 25 countries. A variety of people. We did that intentionally. Remember, there are 6 of us editors that worked as a team. And so we all had different contacts, right? And a great variety of people that contributed, young and old. The youngest, 10 years. The oldest, 86. And that was not Ruth. And that was not me either. That was not us. But that's quite an age spread. A great variety. Some of the names are people whom you have heard. Oh, so-and-so. Well-known church leaders, writers, and so on. Others, you never heard of them. And some of them I never heard of, or Ruth, but somebody on our team did hear of them. And so we worked on that, receiving all these manuscripts, editing them. I had to even translate some of them from another language because they didn't write well in English or couldn't write in English and so on. And so we worked on that as a team. It was stressful in a way, but it was a lot of fun. We look forward to that opportunity. 6 of us from different backgrounds. Ruth said she had met some of them. You still haven't. Cheryl, one of our team members, hasn't met Keith. So it's just been a Zoom type of a meeting. Okay.
And the stories are about, we told them 500 words or less. There's a couple that are longer, but that's a good reason for it.
Well, yeah, because sometimes, you don't tell everybody what to do. There's certain people, you just have to accept what they do.
And what do the writers tell in their stories? And we are going to share a sampling of those stories. Show them the book.
That's what we want to do with you. Share your sampling so you can get an idea of what your fellow Seventh Adventist, if you are a Seventh Adventist, and if you're not, you're certainly familiar with the Sabbath. What do people think about the Sabbath? What does the Sabbath mean to them? It's one thing for theologians to write, and we make references. There's a good bibliography in the back if you want to read about the Sabbath, but quite a few books. That's all well and good. But how do they interpret it in their lives? That's the ultimate question.
And that's the extra is to help people who are studying about the Sabbath.
This is the book called The Gift, What the Sabbath Means to Me. And so we asked them to contribute, and we will just share a sampling with you. That's what we're going to do.
And we had to cut off the stories because we couldn't take more.
We realized one day And somebody said, well, we need to ask so-and-so and so-and-so. And I said, wait a minute, guys, do you realize, the press has given us a limit on how many words they want. And we were already pushing that, and they actually made the book a little bit bigger than they originally planned to do.
And several people have said, you don't have my story, you're going to do a second volume.
Yeah.
So it's possible. So you have a story. I think I contacted Cindy to see if she would write one, and she declined, which is fine.
So now Ruth and I are going to share with you a sample of some of these stories and some of the delights, some of the challenges that people experience about the Sabbath. I want to share with you, first of all, a story of Arthur Stelle. Arthur Stelle is a Seventh Adventist minister who was born in the former Soviet Union. His background is similar to mine. I'm ethnic German, born in former Yugoslavia. Those of you who know your history, in the 1700s, quite a few German people moved eastward to the Balkan countries and to Russia and to all of those areas. And that's Arthur Stelle's background. Today, he's the vice president of the General Conference of Seventh Adventists. Arthur's been a good friend and a colleague and a good minister and a good teacher for many years. Not as many years as I, but not that old yet. During the Soviet period, every man had to serve in the military for a period of time. There was no choice over that. Sabbath was a big issue. What do you do on the Sabbath day? And he tells a story in this book here about what his experience was on the Sabbath and how he kept the Sabbath. And so the title of his chapter is Celebrating Sabbath with Dirty Pigs. He said that on most Sabbaths he was able to convince his sergeant or whatever officer was there to let him go to an empty room and to spend the Sabbath there and not to carry on his regular duties. But sometimes he said it didn't work out. And so he says, one Sabbath, I could not go to the office, so I found another hiding place with smelly pigs. God pointed me to a soldier in charge of the pig farm just outside of our military complex, who caringly allowed me to hide in his pig kingdom. The smell was terrible, and the grunting of the creatures was absolutely foreign to me, but it was warm enough, and nobody found me. Sabbath with dirty, stinky pigs. I felt and smelled like the prodigal son. It may sound paradoxical, but it was better inside with unclean pigs than outside with people. That's how he spent his Sabbath. And then, that's Arthur Stelle. Then I want to tell you of another part of the world, a young lawyer in New York City. Ruth and I met in New York after she left the Midwest, and I left Richmond, Virginia, and we moved to New York. We didn't know each other, and she'll tell you a little bit more about that, but we met. So New York is very special to us. New York is a place of a lot of hustle and bustle. It's a stressful place in many ways. And I sometimes teasingly say, I must not be a very good Adventist because I like living in New York City. Because often you hear Adventists say, you got to leave the city. I know Staten Island, that you weren't quite in New York City, that's the suburbs, But we liked it there. We started our ministry in New York City. And even in retirement, I was intern pastor at a church in New York City, commuting from Maryland. Well, New York City has a lot of offices, a lot of lawyers. Our country has more lawyers per capita than any country in the world, okay? That's just the way our system is. And I can understand a little bit the hustle and bustle of this young lawyer. We have a couple lawyers in our families, a daughter-in-law and a son-in-law. And when you start working as a lawyer in these big firms in New York City or Washington, you really have to work. And you really don't have much to say until you prove yourself. Then later on, things improve. And so Maxroy Mitchell writes about how he started working in a law firm, low at the totem pole, and then he said he found there was a Seventh-day Adventist woman who worked there. He calls her Margaret. Margaret had paved the way for my Sabbath observance by her conduct and example in our office. Her smile and character meant that I did not have to explain or apologize for my Sabbath observance. I could say, I am a Seventh Adventist like Margaret. What a wonderful testimony. And then what to me is kind of what I call quiet humor. That's sometimes the best kind of humor. He says, on Friday afternoons, he would look in Margaret's direction, and Margaret would pull her glasses down, and there was her signal that Sabbath is coming, it's time to go home.
My first one is about Nadia Floater, who is a student in Austria. She is a harpist, and she tells the story about her university professor telling her, I have good news. I received an email, and you have been invited to take part in a recording for a radio channel. Oh, I hope it's not on Sabbath, I thought, privately. Even though my professor knew that I did not perform on Saturdays, except for when I played at church, I did not know whether she would really understand. I declined offers so many times, and yet this year was a very decisive one for my musical future. The professor told her, the second round of Austria's music competition has been canceled. All of the first winners of the first round are invited to participate in a radio broadcast. The date for the recording is October 24, Saturday. Just as I feared. I thought, knowing most recordings were on Sabbath. You will have to talk to your parents and decide whether you can play or what is possible. But we have to know soon if you're going to participate. When I talked to my mother, I knew it was unrealistic, but she said, I would love to play. Couldn't we write an email to the lady and explain why I can't play on Saturday? And he will make it possible then? If not, I will not have a bad feeling. My mother agreed, and we wrote the email. Unexpectedly, the Institute answered back just 2 days later, telling me it would be no problem at all to find an alternative date for me. They later notified me that I was scheduled to play on a Sunday. Although this was exactly what I'd hoped for and prayed, I was really surprised. In the past, my sister, who is older, had often been refused alternative dates from the same institute. At this time, they had no trouble. I praise the Lord forever for the opportunity and have the honor to worship Him every Sabbath. The next story is about a couple that we...
But you know, that story reminds me of our friend, Maria, who had to take her exam. And a lady who lives in Serbia, and how the exam one day after another was scheduled always on Saturday, and the very last opportunity was some months later, and it was finally changed to a Monday. But she had to go through that tension. Can you imagine that? Because without that exam, she would not have received her degree.
This couple we knew in upstate New York, and they moved further up into the Adirondacks, which is where his wife was from. And they had moved up there thinking they will just do their land and live off of it. And then he said, I got to feeling a little bored and felt I needed some variety in my life. And so one day as we were coming home, we stopped by the hardware store and feed store, and I was talking to the owners whom I knew and asked him, could I come in and help at different times in your store? And the man thought, he said, well, let me think about it, I'll get back to you. So then he invited Roger to come in and meet with him and his son. And they said, we'd like you to buy our business. And he was totally surprised. He said, well, I have to talk to my wife. And he said, I have to talk to the Lord. So they made a decision to purchase the store, and it's a big...
It's a feed store. It's a small version of Home Depot, Walmart, grocery store. You know, in the country you often have that kind of stuff wherever. Gasoline station, laundromat.
He made it into some of that.
Yeah, he added them, and car wash, and you name it. Okay.
So they filled out all the papers and they had to send it into the franchise, and the franchise called them and said, well, it looks good, but you put on there that you'll be closed on Saturdays and open on Sundays. We think you made a mistake. And they said, no. He said, Sunday is the busiest day, so that has...
Saturday.
Saturday is
Yeah.
the busiest day, so anyways, they said they were concerned, but they did approve the application. And after a year, the franchise representative told me that he had made many visits to the store to observe what happened on Sunday, and it was always full. And so they were afraid they were going to lose a lot of customers, the franchise was, but they didn't. God worked it all out, and they had to expand, and they doubled the size of our building, adding new business. Within 6 years, we purchased land and built a new store 8 times larger than the previous one. The store was not only a witness to the community, but it also employed many Adventists who did not have to contend with the problem about
If you ever
sound.
go to the Plattsburgh, New York area, look up Windover Home Center.
His son runs it.
His son
now.
run that, and they're still closed on Sabbath, just as they always have been.
He's quite a witness.
Albania was one of the most secular countries in the world. Albania was so secular and so secluded that they broke off diplomatic relations with China and with the Soviet Union because they were not communistic enough. Okay, that's Albania. That's what happened. And the people grew up there in that atmosphere. When communism collapsed there, our church went in to begin evangelism in that environment. And we now have congregations that have been there. I preached to some of those congregations. There's a story of one young lady. I met her as I do some guest teaching for our seminary in Croatia. I was very impressed with this young woman. I taught in person, and then I taught a class by Zoom. And I had to use English for her and Croatian for the other students. So went back and forth, between that. Very faithful young lady who's studying to be a pastor. And she writes how she, for the first time, heard of the Sabbath. That to them was totally strange. And so she writes here, 5 years have passed since the Sabbath that I was baptized, and in my heart there is still the same excitement and love for the Lord. To me, Sabbath is one of the most significant gifts that God gave his children. It is a foretaste of the heavenly world that points us to the love of our Creator and Redeemer. Our loving God is waiting to welcome all those who experience the blessing of the Sabbath on this earth and looking forward to enjoying the Sabbath in eternity. I think we can trust our young people. It's easy to sometimes focus on problems, but God always has people. And God has young people, God has, I met many of them around the world, and I think it's going to be okay. God's church is not going to collapse because of sins of some. God knows what he is doing. So her name is Eugenia. And then there's another young person from California, Riverside, a student at La Sierra Academy. She talks about some of the challenges in her life. And some of these stories, these people talk very frankly about the challenges they experience in their life. This is not all, look how great I am. That's not what it is at all. And then she ends it this way. As a teenager, it is so liberating to know Jesus created the Sabbath to bring me delight. Longing to thank him by honoring his day, I became an Adventist. Because of the Sabbath, I delight more in my friendship with Jesus. Pretty good young person, huh?
Yeah.
Would you love to have that young person be part of your congregation?
Sure,
Okay.
Okay, I have 2 stories from Ohio. Where we are in Maryland, the associate pastor at our church was Andrea Jacobson, who is now at Kettering, the head pastor. And when we were getting ready, starting this book, we heard this sermon because she had moved to Kettering, and we went on YouTube and did the Kettering Church and listened to this sermon, and I said, this has to go in the book. This is one of the longer ones. But she talks about the specialness of the Sabbath, and there's a chart that she used from a man named Abraham Herschel who wrote on the Sabbath, and about the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, but the Sabbath, the center. It's the end, and it was done by God. But you can Google YouTube and watch it yourself probably. It's from a couple of years ago, but it is incredible, and she is so committed to the Sabbath, and we're sorry she's left us, but happy for Kettering.
May I say something about that? Herschel is a Jewish scholar. He's died some years ago. Wrote quite a bit on the Sabbath, a very influential book. And I would appeal to us and suggest to us, we need to connect with people. We need to connect with people who have similar perspectives in the scripture as we do. Early Adventists did a lot more of that. Early Adventists did a lot more. They would even publish books from non-Adventist writers because the topic was of such that was of help. Yesterday when we were listening to the service, one of the presenters said, and as theologian Tom Wright wrote, my ears recognize Tom Wright. Tom Wright is an Anglican priest, Anglican clergyman, and a theologian. Tom Wright has written some wonderful books on the resurrection and the state of the dead that are very, very much like the Seventh Adventists. You see what I'm saying? We may not agree with him on everything, but let's find people where we have some common bond. I know him personally, and I was trying to get him to speak at one of our satellite broadcasts. Why? Because we share that in common. We need to look for people like that and connect with them. Am I next?
No.
Oh, you
I'm
got
just thinking,
yeah.
you have to tell them about, in your introduction, that connection. The Sabbath, the gift,
Yeah.
and the senator.
Oh, yeah. When we were preparing the book, yeah.
I'm off.
When is past? Like 4 o'clock?
One of our daughters said, "You're doing it with her. She goes off script."
Going off script.
It's in the beginning.
Yeah, editor's prep. No, that's not it. Yeah, when we were preparing the book, I came across by a book from another individual, and I wrote the introduction to this book, and I say something like, I believe each writer would agree with these words from the former United States Senator Joe Lieberman. Quote, I love the Sabbath and believe it is God's gift that I want to share with everyone in the hope that they will grow and love it as much as I do. End of quote. And I ended by saying, it is my hope that the stories of this book will help you appreciate the Sabbath as a gift from God. So.
And then they put the footnote in.
Yeah.
Of his book,
yeah.
And his book is called The Gift of Rest.
We didn't know that until ours was chosen. So I said, well, let's do the unexpected. And in evangelism, we need to do the unexpected, by the way. We do too much of the expected. Do the unexpected. And so I got one of these books, put it in an envelope, wrote to Lieberman. He's now connected with a law firm in New York City.
Is he? Okay.
And I said, I quoted you, and I thought it would be interesting for you to receive this. He wrote back a personal, not typed, handwritten note on his letterhead, thanking me for it and telling me what a great relationship he had with Seventh Adventists when he was in the Washington area.
Oh, okay.
So again,
Similar.
we need to connect with people. We need to connect with them and not worry about what do they not agree with us, but rather, where's the commonality? Okay.
Okay, you have to know, this one is by Robert Cundiff. Do you know the new president of the Howe Conference?
New president? It's 2 years, Ruth.
I know. His wife is,
Over 2 years.
we've told him he has to be good to Ashtabula.
Right.
His wife is our foster daughter. Her mother died when she was in grade 11, and she was our second daughter's best friend from elementary school up, and we were asked to take her on her mother's deathbed. And so Bob writes a story for the book. And I laugh because it sounds just like Bob, and although he says, in a recent sermon, I told a humorous story to help illustrate how the Sabbath brings good things into our lives. This sounds like something he would do, very much so. He took his wife out for dinner on our weekly date, and once seated, I promptly pulled out my phone and began to endlessly scroll Twitter. After a few minutes, she reminded me that it was date night and politely asked me to put my phone away. I conceded, but then an important phone call came, and I'm not going to finish it. So
Now, he didn't do that. He said, what would happen if?
Yeah.
Right? And he's comparing the Sabbath with that, how people ignore the Sabbath, just as we ignore each other sometimes in this technological age.
He said, this truth becomes more precious when I realize that the Sabbath was God's idea. He was the one who created the Sabbath, invites me into the Sabbath rest. Why would he do that? Because he is good.
One of our common friends, a man by the name of Charlie Drexel. Charlie was the member of the German Brooklyn Church in New York. We met and we became good friends. I worked for his dad while I was a college student one summer and Christmas break. He was a roofer. And Charlie Drexel got a degree in engineering and worked actually somewhere in the Cleveland area with a nuclear power plant in the early days of that. And of course, a nuclear power plant, you don't just say, oh, I'll be gone for another 30 minutes and then I'll take care of it. There has to be constant supervision going on, very rigid schedule. And those who are on watch have to have very specific training and qualifications and so on. And Charlie ran into problems with the Sabbath. What's he gonna do? And so he explained it to his supervisor. And the supervisor worked it out, and then Charlie writes this. A few days after Memorial Day weekend, I was sitting in the office chatting in Al's office. He told me how he had been brought up a Quaker. He related to me that he, as a conscientious objector, had often spent time in the military jail with Seventh-day Adventists and Sabbath keepers. He said that he knew how important those beliefs were to practicing Adventists. Quote, I knew you were a practicing Adventist by the actions of your around the facility by you, end quote, he stated. God had been working on my problem long before it became an issue for me. It's interesting how what we do today may impact somebody positively or negatively years later. And those soldiers who refused to participate in normal activities on Sabbath never thought of a Charlie Drexel working in Ohio at a nuclear plant and his Sabbath issues. But that's what helped him. And then this first story that came back was John Brunt. John Brunt was a professor at Walla Walla, pastor in Azure Hills in Southern California. He, like I, retired but kept on working here and there, and that's fun to do. And so he has written on the Sabbath. John was the first one to send us a story on the Sabbath. And he writes not theology, not theory, but experience. And he says when he was a younger individual, he went to Emory University in Atlanta area to work on his doctorate degree in New Testament studies. His wife was working on a degree in nursing. They had 2 children. And when both parents are studying, they wanted to be sure that the children enjoy the Sabbath. So they planned each week what to do. He talks about that in his chapter. And that each child was allowed to choose the activities for this Sabbath, the other one for the next Sabbath, and so on, which I think is a wonderful type of a plan. But then John came to a critical point. He had to do his comprehensive examinations, writings, And I know what that is. I've gone through that a number of times myself, where you do a big project and you either pass or fail based on that project. Going through it 3 times in my life. And so he writes at the busyness of the week, and it wasn't just him. The other students writing day and night, hardly sleeping, trying to do the best they could. And the following Monday, let's see, where is John's?
1:11.
1:11. Okay, yeah. And John turned in his stuff the following Monday, the deadline, and he writes this. My fellow students knew about my Sabbath observance, but after I turned the paper in, one of them said, quote, I bet you worked on your Sabbath this week, end quote. I was happy to say that though it was one of the most grueling and sleep-deprived weeks of my life, sundown to sundown, from Friday until sundown Sabbath, I put the project aside and enjoyed my weekly oasis in time with God and my family. And I could relate that. I remember I did part of my education at the City University of New York, then we transferred to Andrews. And I remember I looked always forward to the Sabbath, to Friday afternoon. I physically, literally took my books and put them away. They're gone. Not just the math books either. All books, religion, whatever, everything was gone, so that it would not interfere with the enjoyment of the Sabbath.
My next 2 stories are from Jan Paulson, who was the former General Conference president.
Well, he is the former.
Yes.
He still is.
And Sandy Finley Duran, you know who Mark Finley is. This is his sister. And she worked with us as a teenager. But we are gone over so long, I think I would like that we should skip and you should go to the next.
Sure. Okay. Beautiful story, again, when he was a student in Germany, the Sabbath experience that he had. You will do this one.
Yes, I'm going to do
Okay,
that.
all right. Well, I wrote a chapter called Thank God the Sabbath is Coming.
Each editor had to write a chapter.
Yeah, each of us had to also contribute a chapter. And by the way, these chapters are short. Some of them are less than a page. You can see what they look like.
Like a devotional.
That was intentional. I was born in the former Yugoslavia, and when World War II ended, I think I may have mentioned this before, all ethnic Germans were put in concentration camps in the former Yugoslavia under the communist government. And that included my family. I was just a little baby.
He was a year old, so he was
Okay.
really dangerous.
Yeah, I was a real danger to the government, okay? And so we survived. And that in itself is a miracle because most didn't, okay? In our camp, there were only 7 of us children that survived the camp. The others all died off. So after the war, after they released us, it wasn't much different. By the way, we were released symbolically to us, not to them, on a Sabbath day. Sabbath morning, March 17, we were released. So afterward, life wasn't really that much better at all. Persecution in the school, police used to come looking for my dad to take him to a work camp. And you lived in a world of fear. What do you say? Who's going to listen to you? There was home and there was the rest of the world, okay? Always living in that tension, being very much aware of it. School was 6 days a week, and you tried to explain to a communist teacher why you're not going to be in school. It's a little bit of a challenge, but somehow it worked out. But life was not all that different from the camp, actually. And yet what I remember, my parents, every Friday afternoon.
In the camp and out.
Well, out of the camp, I don't remember those words.
Yeah.
But after the camp, I remember Friday afternoons, one of them would say, no matter how bad the week was, thank God the Sabbath is coming.
Oh, wow.
Thank God the Sabbath is coming. And in some way this sounded strange to me as a kid, but yet these words became words of comfort. Thank God the Sabbath is coming. And that period, that special period of time, became sacred to us. Kind of isolated and insulated from the chaos in which we lived.
Okay, this is part of my last story. I asked our oldest daughters met her husband in Iceland. They were student missionaries. And her husband's mother and I were classmates at Andrews. And this story I'd never heard, but I'd asked, she writes stories too. So I asked her to write for the book. And she writes a story, and I'm reading it, and I'm saying, what? How is this possible? And she's talking, they were in Alaska. Her father was a doctor, and he was in Anchorage, Alaska at Fort Richardson. And she starts out the story about these 4 private first class young men being put into hard labor because they would not work on the Sabbath. And they all attended the Anchorage Adventist Church and had been guests many times in their home. And she considered them big brothers. And then on the 30th of January, they attended a service in a chapel in the stockade, and to encourage these 4 young Adventists who were in prison. As we walked through the chapel door, they were all up front playing and singing, and the song "All the Way My Savior Leads Me," and she was just really touched. Originally, they had been charged with mutiny.
That's serious.
Yeah. And then there was a dentist. Now listen to this name, Captain Harry Schlau. Okay? He was in the Geneva Church for many years.
Madison.
And he was a dentist, okay? I'll tell more about that later. He was there and worked at the same dental clinic, and he was put on house arrest and charged with being the ringleader of the mutiny, a charge that carried a penalty of 20 years in the penitentiary. 2 ministers from North Pacific and the Pacific Union Conference came to Anchorage, met with the military officers' effort to obtain release of the young men. The mutiny charges were dropped, and Captain Slough was released from house arrest. And Harry and Juanita had 3 boys, and Kirsten used to be their babysitter, the one that wrote this story. They were still court-martialed and found guilty of disobeying an order because they honored God's Sabbath over the country they loved. Eventually, the senators from their home states were notified of what happened to the soldiers, and the senators connected the Pentagon, the headquarters of the United States military, and the 4 servicemen's sentences were suspended. Each was sent to a different base in Alaska, and they missed worshiping with them. But seeing them, those people imprisoned for their loyalty to the Sabbath and the Lord of the Sabbath, made me determined to be faithful to Jesus. Oh Lord, give me the courage and conviction of those people.
It's amazing how our actions impact other people, isn't it?
Yes, so.
Okay, then the rest of the story. In '59, the Ashtabula Church held an evangelistic series with a speaker, Elder Fortis Dedamore. Okay, my husband, my mother's cousin, Harry Schlau, the first Adventist dentist missionary to China, worked with Elder Dedamore in China. And I'm sure that when he was the one that got him to come to do these meetings. And then Harry called my mom and said, Belda, I'm coming to get you to go to the meetings. And my brother and I came. At the end, I enrolled in the BOP Bible Correspondence course. Upon completion, I was baptized by Pastor Charles Shope. I don't know if any of you remember him.
This is a young
I
congregation.
know. And I believe the meetings were held in a Baptist church, and the baptism was there because I remember coming out of the water telling God, I want to serve you. This was my junior year in high school, and my parents separated and divorced. In the spring of '60, my mother took a job in the Ohio Conference. My mother and brother moved to Mount Vernon, and I had to stay behind for 6 weeks to finish my junior year of high school in Kingsville, which I had gone to from first grade. There were 30 of us in that class. I stayed with a new Adventist, and her name was Nancy, and I can't remember her last name. And she had 3 children, and she usually sits right where you're sitting.
You're not thinking of Doris, are you?
What?
Doris?
Doris, sorry.
Doris
Doris
Newman.
Newman.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
She kept, I was thinking her name was Nancy.
Yeah.
Doris.
Doris.
Okay. And I lived with them so I could finish my last 6 weeks of my junior year. The following year, I went to Mount Vernon Academy. In the spring of '61, I came with 2 other students and participated in a church service in Asheville on the West Avenue. And upon my completion of my 2-year degree at Andrews, I had 3 calls for employment, each for a position in the office. One, the new Kettering Hospital, one for the Voice of Prophecy in California, and one in New York City to work at Faith for Today. On June 19th, I flew to New York City. On that same day, a young man came from Richmond, Virginia. We met a year and a half later and married on July 25, 1965, and the rest is history. God has led. I am honored to serve Him and to keep the Sabbath.
Amen.
So, Pastor Mike, this is a copy we're going to leave with you for the church, for the church library, okay? A little reminder.
We will do.
All right. What is your Sabbath story? I wish we had time, and maybe
Yeah.
at lunchtime.
Do it over lunch.
We all have Sabbath stories, and that's what we try to do. Instead of entering into arguments, there's an awful lot of arguing going on in Adventist Church today, and it absolutely does very little for our faith. A lot of arguing. Instead of entering into arguments, let's share with each other what the Lord means to us, what the second coming means to us, what the Sabbath means to us, what our faith means to us. When we do that, God will bless us.
Yes. Amen.